Hello, and welcome to First Tuesdays. This is a monthly webinar offered by the Washington State Library as part of our strategic goal to help professional skills among all of the library staff statewide. First of all, welcome this morning. I have a bit of business to attend to before I turn you over to our presenter today. My name is Tammy Masonheimer. I'm the training coordinator here at the State Library, and I am your facilitator. This is my contact information. If you have any questions or any comments about our program, or if you ever have something that you think would make a good First Tuesdays presentation, please feel free to contact us. Jeremy Stroud is our technical support person. Hi, Jeremy. Jeremy, he's going to go ahead and put his contact information into the chat just in case anyone needs some extra help or if you have any technical issues while you're listening today. We will also be recording this webinar and it will be posted on the Washington State Library training page. So First Tuesdays are brought to you by the Washington State Library, which is part of the Office of Secretary of State. Our funder is the Institute of Museum and Library Services through the LSTA Act. And as a requirement of our funding, we're going to ask that you take a short 4-question survey that will appear when you close the window at the end of our presentation today. And it's important information that we actually use in our annual report so we can continue our funding for training such as this. And thank you in advance for your feedback on that. And so today we have a really great presentation. First, I want to thank Alexa Andrews for taking the time today to talk to us about women in leadership and what science says and how to move forward in the area of MeToo. And at Alexa's request, questions may be entered into chat and we'll ask them of her at the very beginning. And at the end of the webinar she'll be available to answer questions. So thank you, Alexa, for joining us today and talking to us about women in leadership. And without further ado, here's Alexa.
All right. Well, thank you, Tammy, and thanks everyone for being here. I am really excited to give this presentation because I think that a lot of the information in it can be a real game changer for all of us who are in the working field. So again, my name is Alexa and my pronouns are she and her. And this is a presentation that's been evolving over the course of a few years. And I last presented it at the Washington Library Association conference in Yakima last year. And we've got a little bit of a shorter time today, so in the interest of the clock, I'm going to take questions at the end, like Tammy, to make sure we get through everything. And I'm also going to give you a link at the end to access my presentation and all of my reference materials and a lot of other information. So don't worry about taking notes because you're going to have all of my slides, and you're also going to have a lot of the stuff that I say to you pretty much verbatim. So don't worry about taking notes. You're going to have it all. And I do have a tendency to talk pretty fast. I promise I'm making an effort to slow down, but Tammy, feel free to jump in if I need to slow down a little bit more. So I like to start off with just a little story because it kind of gets me comfortable talking to you. So when I was taking driver's ed at 16 years old, my male instructor handed out 2 different lists to the young men and young women at that course of the supplies that we'd need to keep in our cars for emergencies. So the list for young men had the usual things, and the list for young women only had 2 things on it. It was a pair of jumper cables and a mini skirt. And he told us that all we had to do if we were in trouble was put the mini skirt on and stand on the side of the road with the jumper cables. And when a man, because he assumed it was going to be a man, stopped to see what was wrong, we were just supposed to hold out the jumper cables and ask, how do I change a tire with this? I'm a 29-year-old millennial, so this was just 13 years ago. And again, I tell you this story just to break the ice a bit. It's a little bit sad, a little bit funny. But I'm going to tell you right now that this presentation is definitely not about doom and gloom and sadness, because when it comes to putting women in positions of leadership around the country, we are making incredible progress, and I feel very hopeful for our future, even if we haven't quite shattered that glass ceiling yet. So I've got a few outcomes that I hope we're going to achieve together today. And one is that you leave with a clearer understanding of the challenges that are faced by women in the workplace today and common professional pitfalls that we fall into. Two, that you understand some of the gendered differences in perception of workplace behavior. That's kind of a mouthful, and how we're all affected by them. And that you leave knowing some actions that you can take for yourself and also for your organization. There are also three parts to this presentation. So first, we're going to very briefly go over the current landscape of what it looks like for women in leadership right now. Then we're going to talk about why these disparities continue to exist and several theories about gendered behavior. That's really the meat of this presentation. And then we're going to talk about how libraries size up as a female-dominated industry, and just a little bit about the MeToo movement. And then we're going to talk about, in our last part, what you can do. So let me move on to my next slide here. There we go. There are some caveats. So I want to be painfully clear about the scope of this presentation because it's just one facet of this huge and complex issue of gender dynamics in America. And I also want to be clear that we are not at all criticizing men today. They need to be part of the solution, and the science says that we do our best work when we are all represented and working together. But we are discussing why some of the institutional advantages given to men persist today. So again, we only have a short time together. We're going to be operating on a few assumptions. The first one is that inequity exists at the structural level, and that is what we need to address. So I'm going to present a few numbers, but mainly we're talking about why it continues to exist and not proving that it does. The second one is that we're assuming that everybody here knows enough human history to know how we got here. So we're not discussing what led to this inequity historically. And then the last one is that we're discussing the situation in the United States of professional women, which is a group that arguably already has a measure of privilege. So I would like to just take a second to acknowledge that there are many women around the world who are still fighting for basic human rights and autonomy of their bodies. And I also want to be clear about where I'm coming from. As a white, middle-class, college-educated, and cisgender individual, I want to acknowledge that it is a privilege and a luxury to have the time and institutional support to research, write, and talk about these issues. And I think that's all I'm going to say about privilege, because that isn't really what we're talking about today, even though I think it is important to call attention to it as definitely a layer of the conversation about gender. And something that we've learned from the ongoing movement to advance racial equality is that focusing solely on the actions of individuals really denies the reality that the inequity we're seeing represents the natural outcome of a power structure that benefits specific groups at the expense of others. So again, we're going to talk about a lot of individual things, but what I'm really trying to get at is that systemic issue, and how do we address that? All right, so I've got an infographic up here, and one of the benefits about doing this as a webinar is that I know you all can see it clearly, as opposed to giving this presentation in person. I realized that a lot of this information was pretty small up on the screen. So one thing that I want to call your attention to, and I believe you can see my mouse here, is that women earn 60% of all undergraduate and all master's degrees. So we are earning more advanced degrees, but if you hop down into this bottom right corner here, you can see that women are represented with this lovely salmon color and men with the lovely pink or lovely purple color. That women with master's degrees are still only earning roughly 2/3 of what men are earning with the same degree. And it's a little bit better with the bachelor's degree, but you can see there's at every level, there's a disparity, which we're already aware of. One thing I like to note is that down here on the bottom, in the middle on the bottom, is that I don't really have any information to explain why this is, but it does look like that the younger age groups here are getting a little bit better representation and pay next to men, which is cause for hope. And then the last piece that I want to look at is up here in the top right. And this has to do with the women who are at the sort of very top of their game. So executive officers, 14.6% 14.6 of them are women. We're only 8.1% of top earners. Of Fortune 500 CEOs, we only are 4.6%, and then we're only 6.9% of Fortune 500 board seats. And this infographic is from 2014, I believe, and I've got a couple updated numbers on that. So as far as Fortune 500 board seats, we have actually risen up to 22.2% for as of 2018. So we're making a lot of progress there. But the crazy thing is that as far as that CEO number, the Fortune 500 CEOs, we've only gained 0.2%. We're only at 4.8% in that same period. And so we're going to spend most of our time today on why researchers think that we're really struggling to gain those top positions. And then I also want to share with you something called the John statistic. So this presentation was really inspired by a book that I read called How Women Decide by Therese Huston. It's a really excellent read. I definitely recommend that you give it a look. But she cites something she likes to call the John statistic, which is when you look at the S&P 1500, and that's the Standard & Poor's 1500, it's a stock market index of US stocks. So when you look at the S&P 1500, there are more male CEOs named John than there are female CEOs of any name, which is pretty crazy. But again, I'm going to give you the good news right away, and that is that in half a dozen global studies conducted by people like Goldman Sachs and Columbia University or organizations, they have found that companies employing women in large numbers outperform their competitors on every measure of profitability. So it really is better when we work together. Okay, so here's another quick infographic. It's a little outdated, it's from 2014, but I do have updated information for 2017. So this is what women make on the dollar for what men earn. So for all women workers, we're actually up to 80 cents. We've gained a cent in those 5 years. For African American women, they're up to 61 cents. Hispanic women actually went down to 53 cents by 2017. And then I also have another number for Native American women who are earning, as of 2017, 58 cents to the dollar. And then the wage gap for mothers with full-time year-round jobs, they're at 71 cents. So they're kind of in between all women and African American women. And I just want to point this out to you because I just want everyone to note that everything we're talking about today is even more difficult for women of color for a variety of reasons that we're also going to discuss. And it's also really difficult for researchers to break apart the things that they're studying about each of these groups individually, because so many people belong to more than one group. You know, you're a woman and you're Black, or you're a woman and you're Hispanic, and you identify as LGBTQIA. So, you know, it's where this concept of intersectionality becomes really important. And that's a lot of the reason why we don't have numbers pertaining to a lot of these individual groups, because it's so complex to break them apart into different things. But I just want to get the message across that everything we're talking about, just keep in mind that for women of color, it's going to be a little bit harder. All right, so this is where I'm going to ask all of you to contribute. So in the chat, I'm looking at the chat. Can you tell me what is some typical advice for how you get ahead in the workplace? Like what are some things that people told you growing up, or that you've heard around the office? Smile. Yes, I like that one. Smile. Give you a second. Get an education, sure. That's big. You got anyone else? I'll give you another minute. Listen more than you speak. That's a good one. Be a team player, sure. Work harder than everyone else. I'm glad you said that. Loyalty. Yeah, as a person of color, you have to be twice as good to be accepted, definitely. All right, so I'll stop there with the chat. Some other ones I'll add. So I like that someone called out, if you work hard, if you show dedication, that you're going to get noticed. Finding mentors and sponsors is another one I hear. Asking for promotions and raises. That doesn't always apply in the library world because we're publicly funded often, but that's another one. Or being willing to sacrifice your home life, you know, being available on your phone all the time. Those are all things that that are, you know, part of the typical American success story. And unfortunately, what research is showing is that those strategies don't really work for women. And we're going to come back to that. So Next slide. So what makes a good leader? In 2015, the Pew Foundation asked 2,800 Americans in different roles and occupations to answer this question. What makes a good leader? So again, I'm going to ask you in the chat, what do you guys think makes a good leader? What are some qualities that you would like to see in a leader? Before I tell you what the answers were to the study. Good listener, vision, knows how to follow others, sure. Listens and acts, work ethic, can delegate, understanding, sure. Lead by example, input from all staff, someone humble. I'm glad that you guys are saying all of these because I feel like they're gonna fit into what we're talking about. Support staff, treats everyone the same, consistency, sure. Okay, well, so in answer to the study, they had 3 that rose to the top, that about 80% or a little over 80% of these 2,800 Americans responded. And they were honesty, which I think some of you hit on, intelligence, and decisiveness. So 8 out of 10 people agree that a good leader must possess these qualities, which means that if your boss, your coworkers, your hiring team doesn't perceive you as having them, it's going to be a lot harder to get that promotion. And here is where we're going to talk about how important other people's perceptions are. So I've got another infographic here. This is from the Pew Research Center. This is kind of a map of their responses for some of these top qualities. And in the green, or I guess, so next, after they asked people about these qualities, they asked, is this trait more true of women, more true of men, or equally true of both? So the green is the respondents who said this is more true of women, yellow more true of men, and then the numbers on the right equally true of both. So you can see that women we're definitely given the upper hand in compassion and organization and honesty, which was one of those qualities, interestingly. We're about equal in being innovative and our intelligence. And then men have the upper hand in ambition and decisiveness. And we're really going to focus in on decisiveness to sort of illustrate this concept. So decisiveness is one of those issues where women are fighting an uphill battle, against the cultural stereotype that women are indecisive. So think about that phrase, it's a woman's prerogative to change her mind. And I'm not going to go into where that came from. I'm sure some of you know, but I still hear it thrown around occasionally. So we're going to talk about how all of these perceptions that women are compassionate, organized, and honest, and men are ambitious and decisive, how they fit into traditional gender roles. So this is another concept that I took from Therese Huston and How Women Decide, and it's this secret agents versus mother ducks idea. So either subconsciously or not, these are the roles that Huston says we tend to expect male and female leaders to take in our culture. So men are secret agents, and we've seen this play out in countless movies, and Therese Huston has a more eloquent quote that I really love, so I'm going to read it to you guys. So this is her description of the secret agent. So our hero is waiting on a rooftop for instructions, and the person at headquarters finally gives the command. James, we need you to do X, Y, and Z in that order. James? The camera cuts back to the roof, and the audience sees an earpiece, presumably his earpiece, abandoned on the ground. He's off doing whatever he's decided is best, and moviegoers are both anxious and thrilled, bothered that he's ignoring the plan, but trusting that he's pegged exactly what's needed. He is competent, he is independent, he's forceful, and he is decisive. He's a secret agent. But our culture views women more as mother ducks. So she may lead and go first, but she's going to take care that everyone makes it to the other side of the road. She's foremost paying attention to others' needs. She's making democratic decisions that include everyone's input and feelings. And from that previous slide, she's compassionate, she's organized, and she's honest. So again, that feeds into this common misconception that women take care while men take charge. And this is great for women as middle managers, but not as CEOs. And we actually do see lots of women attaining levels of leadership and taking on management roles, and we're really comfortable with that as a society, but still very few that rise to the top of a company, which is really what we're talking about today. So So the question is regarding decisiveness again, is there really a difference? And the answer is probably not. So research has found differences in decisiveness between different cultures, but they have not found evidence of a distinct difference between men and women within the same culture. And the reality is that women live in a judgment trap in spite of this. And you know, whether they are equally decisive or not is beside the point, because get this, neither gender likes women who exhibit decisive behavior. And we're going to come back to that on the next slide. So research shows over and over that for the same decisions in business, women are judged more harshly than men. So I've got a really great example here. Many of you may recognize this name. So Marissa Mayer, she was the CEO of Yahoo in 2013. And at that time, she ended a generous work from home policy. Now, Hubert Joly is a name that not really as many people recognize. He was also at that same time the CEO of Best Buy, and he did the same thing. He ended a really generous work from home policy just 1 week after Mayer made that announcement for Yahoo. So Mayer has, she still pops up in news articles. Sometimes I still see her name coming up around. But she's been called the Stalin of Silicon Valley. And people blogging about her, picturing her as this cruel woman sort of tearing her way up to the top by pulling other women down. And there were headlines for a few months about the Best Buy decision, but we're not still talking about that one 6 years later. Wow, we are still talking about Marissa Mayer. And you might think, okay, if it was really you might think, okay, if it was really about the decision, we'd still be talking about both of them. But, and you also might think that, okay, so maybe the Yahoo decision affected a lot more employees, but the Best Buy decision actually affected 20 times the employees than the Yahoo decision. So it was way more impactful for Best Buy's employees. But I'm going to argue that the reason we're still talking about Mayer is that she acted outside of our expectations for women. So, you know, we expect Hubert Joly to make a tough decision for the business's bottom line. That's too bad, but he did what he thought was right, and we as a society accept that. He had to make a tough call. But with Mayer, she also made a tough call, and now she is a betrayer of women and families. And again, she's pictured clawing her way to the top by tearing other women down. And I think there's a quote about her turquoise heeled Manolos, again, focusing on what she's wearing. But my question is, why does she bear responsibility for working families and Joly does not? So one of the potential answers is role incongruity theory. Basically role incongruity theory says we like people more when they behave in ways that fit society's typical roles for them, and we like them less when they don't. So women are either competent or likable, but not both. And we already naturally associate the qualities and actions of leadership as we think of it with men. Ambition, decisiveness, so it doesn't surprise us. When they make a tough call, like Hubert Joly, it fits our expectations. But we don't have those same deeply rooted associations with women and leadership. We expect women to be nurturing, considerate, friendly. And the thing is, we may actually like those traits better, but those also aren't the traits we look for in CEOs. So in a study called Can an Angry Woman Get Ahead, researchers found that men who expressed anger in an interview were perceived to be more qualified and more capable and were given positions of higher authority. When women expressed anger, it turned the interviewers off. They didn't like them. So women are also punished unequally for making mistakes at work. And research has shown that when men make a poor decision, it doesn't follow them nearly as long as when a woman exhibits the same poor judgment. So role incongruity theory is something that researchers are looking at right now as a way to explain why women get such pushback when they try to inhabit the spaces and behaviors traditionally assigned to men in our society. And we all know what this looks like in practice. So I've got a couple of little cartoons here that I think are really great. So setting a deadline to say, this has to be done by Monday. You know, that's a finite sentence, but seen as threatening. But the non-threatening way is to say something like, what do you think about getting this done by Monday? So it's not really a direct statement. It's we make it more of an indirect ask. So we're not saying this has to be done. We're asking, what do you think about it? Another one, this one hits really close to home for me. So send me the presentation when it's ready, period. Can be seen as threatening when a woman types that. The non-threatening way to email a request might be, hey Jake, exclamation point, can I take a peek at your presentation when it's ready? Smiley face. thanks, exclamation point, smiley face. And again, this is adding this extra language in to really soften our words, because if we make a direct request, it's seen as threatening. And I myself have had to give myself a strict limit of 1 exclamation point and 1 smiley face in all of my email communication, because I definitely fall into this one. Okay. And hearing a sexist comment, this one unfortunately we're all familiar with too. So someone says something inappropriate, we could say, you know, that's not appropriate and I don't appreciate it. But that's seen as threatening, and the non-threatening way that, again, we're all familiar with is to give that awkward laugh. And this one's kind of hard because there's sort of an extra layer of potential for violence kind of thrown in. So next we're going to talk about stereotype threat. And stereotype threat is the anxiety that you'll live up to someone else's negative expectations of your group, whichever group that might be. So this idea came out of a Stanford University study in 1995 from researchers who were trying to understand an achievement gap between African American students and white students in the US. So unfortunately what they were seeing is that African American students don't do as well as white students on standardized tests. So what they did is they took sophomores from the school, so you know, early on students, and they gave them a section of 30 questions from the GRE, that test you take to get into graduate school, and they selected the questions to be very, very difficult so that they could be, you know, totally sure that any sophomore taking them would struggle. They wanted them to struggle with the questions. And then they split the group in half, and they told half of the students, the first half, that the test was going to measure their intelligence and potential. They told the second half that they were only studying how people solve problems and they weren't going to be measuring their aptitude. So African American students in the first group, the group that was told that they were measuring their intelligence and their potential, they scored 25% lower than white students on those questions. In the second group, where they were told that all the researchers were interested in was their problem solving strategies and not their aptitude, they did just as well as the white students, which is interesting. So what studies like this are finding is that the threat of living up to a negative stereotype causes anxiety that leaves less room to focus on the task at hand. So because not only are you afraid of poorly representing yourself as an individual, all the standard testing anxiety, you're worried about negatively representing the group you belong to. So another study found that by asking women about how others might perceive their score right before they take a math test could drop their score by as much as 59%. I mean, that is huge. So basically, being reminded that you are part of a disadvantaged group makes you falter in ways that you might not otherwise. So for women in positions of power, I think many of us are keenly aware of the stereotype of the successful, cold, and I'm going to say the word bitchy woman, and being afraid of being seen that way is what causes us to soften our actions. And soften our words, like in those last slides. I'm going to take a second and take a sip of tea here. Okay, so this again is one of those places where intersectionality becomes really important, because a woman might already be struggling with her femaleness in the workplace, but then she also has to contend with the stereotypes of being a woman of color, a queer woman, a trans woman, whichever group they might belong. So as an example, I've got a picture of Serena Williams up here because a New York Times article caught my eye last year about her loss at the US Open last year. So she was penalized by an umpire unfairly, she thought, and she got angry and she yelled at him. She called him a liar and a thief, and the umpire penalized her again for that outburst. And that second penalty, it cost her the game. So she lost the game because of it. And the big question is, if she were a man, would she have gotten that second penalty? And lots of folks have been citing similar circumstances in men's games where they got upset, they yelled at the umpire. And they didn't get a penalty for that behavior. So this is a great illustration because Williams first might be running into role incongruity territory by acting aggressively. Women shouldn't act aggressive. She was also running into the stereotype of an out of control, emotional woman. But then there's also this negative stereotype of the angry Black woman. So if you're suffering from stereotype threat, then all of this is potentially background noise while you try to make a decision, take a test, give a presentation, process what's happening at the moment. And you might think, okay, well, that's, you know, sports, this is the office or the library. But if you think about that example that I gave earlier about a woman expressing anger being seen as a less attractive hire than a man who expresses anger. It lends him authority and it costs her opportunity. So for a Black woman working, she not only has to be conscious of the ways she's perceived as a woman, but she also has to be conscious of the ways she's perceived as a Black woman. And I think it's safe to say that these pressures are manifold in an industry like ours that's predominantly white. So I think that's something we also need to be aware of. Okay, moving on to the confidence gap. This is one of my favorite ones, and I have an image here from the Girl Scouts. Girl Scouts campaign to ban bossy, which I was a kid who was often called bossy, so this one also strikes really close to home for me. And here it says the confidence gap starts early. Between elementary and high school, girls' self-esteem drops 3.5 times more than boys' self-esteem. And I'm gonna say, when you call a girl bossy, you're essentially telling her to stay in her lane and act like her gender. And this is damaging, and it represents the early roots of the confidence gap. So compared with men, research again shows over and over that women don't consider ourselves as ready for promotions. We predict we're going to do worse on tests and generally underestimate our abilities. So what this looks like in practice, the confidence gap. So men initiate salary negotiations 4 times as often as women. And when women do initiate negotiations, they ask for 30% less. And when HP, that's Hewlett and Packard, reviewed their personnel files when they were trying to figure out how to get more women into top management, they found that women only applied for promotions when they met 100% of the qualifications. But men were happy to apply for those promotions when they met 60%. So the story there is that women only feel confident applying for promotions when we think we are perfect, and men are just happy to give it a shot. So, and this is supported by research. It shows that women tend to play by the rules. We feel that with enough hard work, and again, this is something that I think some of you said in the comments, with enough hard work and our achievements are going to be noticed and rewarded on their own. But this can be devastating to women's long-term careers. So if you think about this, so say you've got John and you've got Sally, and they both graduate from the same program in college at the same time. They get jobs in the same field at the same level at the same time. But if John feels more confident applying for that promotion, say 2 years before Sally does, he's going to 2 years earlier be having the benefit of a higher title, of a higher wage, and that's going to compound over a lifetime. You know, if you think that they both move up, but John moves up faster than Sally because he is willing to go for those opportunities. And the thing is that studies show no difference in performance of men and women on tests in the workplace, yet over and over again, women report lower expectations of ourselves. And again, what does this look like? It looks like a hesitancy to step into roles, hesitancy to ask for opportunities or to celebrate our own success. Like you're perhaps feeling a lack of authenticity or playing a role. And that brings us to our next slide, which is imposter syndrome. So imposter syndrome, again, is really just feeling like you're playing a role and that you lack authenticity in your work. And a personal example of this is at my first professional job outside of college, I was terrified to take notes at meetings because I felt like I wasn't going to do it right. And I thought that if I volunteered, they were going to see that my work didn't measure up, and they'd know that they'd hired a fraud. And I really felt this to my bones. And thinking back, it feels so silly now. I had a college degree, I took notes in classes. Certainly I could have taken notes in meetings and been just fine. If anything, it made me look like I wasn't contributing or doing my fair share because I was never willing to volunteer to take notes. So that's just my example. But at this point, you know, I would also like to point out that men are certainly not immune from these mental traps, definitely not. But I also hope that I've sort of begun to plant the seed about why they might impact women to a greater degree in the workplace. And I also want to circle back to remind everyone that while we're talking about things that affect individuals, it's the larger system that produces these issues that we're fighting against. So now we're going to move on to the next part of our presentation. We're going to talk about how libraries stack up. And give me just a second to have another sip of tea again. Okay, thank you. So libraries, the numbers. In 2016, the Bureau of Labor Statistics reported that just under 80% of librarians are female, and just over 86% identify as white. And in 2011, that's the most recent number I could find, The median weekly earnings for women librarians were 77% of their male counterparts. So I'm willing to bet that we're keeping up with the general workforce. And again, these wage gaps are compounded for people of color. And all of this persists even when controlled for experience. So you can't explain it by saying someone might just have a little more experience. And as far as gendered breakdowns of people in directorships versus the rest of the profession, the most recent numbers I could find for that are about 20 years out of date. So I think it's safe to say it might be time to look at this again in our profession. But I will say that our representation even back then is better than in the private sector. But we do still have a disproportionate number of men in the very top positions, even though we're a female-dominated industry. And this is really similar to other female-dominated industries. And as another personal example, we have I guess the equivalent of an office manager at our administrative office at the library system I work for. And I was chatting with her at one point, and she made a comment about how when she goes out into our branches, she thought it was really interesting because she doesn't see any men out there. It's all women, and not exclusively, but this was kind of her perception, that when she goes out into the branches, she only ever sees women working. But there are a higher percentage of men working at our administrative office. And you know, who's working at the administrative office? It's the heads of departments and people in those higher positions. And there are some theories that are being tossed around about why this might be. And I'm gonna tell you these, but I also want to preface it by saying that I haven't even necessarily formed an opinion myself on these. They're not necessarily positive or negative, they're just potential explanations. Because the men that we're talking about, you know, the men in my administrative office, we all love working with them. They're great contributors to our profession, they're wonderful people. You know, at the end of it, the individuals are not what we're talking about. What we're talking about is the pattern systemically. So these are some things that have been tossed around that might help explain this discrepancy in the library world. So one of them is that contemporary leadership practices might value experience outside the field, which may fast track men to top positions. So if they're high up in their own field, they make a transition into the library world, we might see that and be like, oh great, diverse experience. Library directorships often focus on elements of those traditional leadership qualities that we talked about that tend to prefer men. So that might also lend them a hand in getting those positions. And then also the last one is that because men tend to be the minority in our profession, their opinions might be given unequal weight in an attempt to reach a level of diversity. And again, it's such a hard thing to form an opinion on because of course we would. We know that having everybody represented is going to get us a better outcome. So of course we want to have everybody represented. But these are just some things that have been discussed in the literature I've read that might help explain that. And moving tracks just a little bit, we're going to talk for just a minute about harmful stereotypes in libraries that could contribute to this problem. And I think you all know which stereotypes I'm talking about. So that would be the uptight librarian and the sexy librarian. And these really represent some root issues in service industries in general. So both of these, they represent unease with female authority. So this is a quote, "Instead of being portrayed as community mobilizers, stewards of complex cultural narratives, and an essential link to organized knowledge, librarians are presented as either uptight, unattractive, shushing gatekeepers, or the objects of sexual fantasy." So these stereotypes pave the way for bad behavior, because it is really challenging to object to inappropriate attention when doing so only reinforces a stereotype. And in this one, I kind of think that, I think this one is easily represented when, at least how I've observed it in my branches, that when we're working with teenagers, everyone has such a hard time shushing teenagers. And I think part of that comes from, they could be a little bit unpredictable, which is why I love them. But I think it's also because we don't want to be seen as these shushing gatekeepers. You know, we want them to think we're approachable, and so it's hard to tell them to shush because we're afraid of feeding into that stereotype for them. But we live in a society that often equates service, which is a lot of what our jobs do, with submissiveness, and this is reinforced by the way women are socialized. We're socialized to be submissive. Again, think about those ways we soften our language. We don't want to say, "Please have this," you know, not even "Please have this to me by Friday." We need to say, "What do you think about having this to me by Friday?" It's a much more submissive way to say that. And this puts us in a position where it's easy for patrons to abuse their power over us under this guise of friendliness. And of course we want to be friendly and engaged, and we don't want to offend, so we laugh off the slightly inappropriate comments. But I really think we need to reframe the way that we think about public service, and not just in our sector and others too, but to require mutual respect. So encoding this in policy is going to help women move beyond sort of these institutionalized social conventions that make us react in these submissive ways to inappropriate behavior. And if our staff can view their response to low-level inappropriate conduct as an enforcement of policy as opposed to just a personal reaction, we're probably going to be more likely to interrupt these situations when they happen and assert that that conduct is unacceptable, which it is. Again, this shows up in other female-dominated professions, nurses, secretaries, teachers, and they just reinforce powerful narratives of gender identity. And another piece I'll throw in there is that because women choose these careers ostensibly because we love them, or we love to read, so we're librarians, or are bound to be good at them because of our feminine caretaking traits, it's okay to pay us less. So these industries often also are lower paid than other industries. Okay, moving on to MeToo, just a brief touching on MeToo. So this movement exploded, about 1.5 years, 2 years ago, but I do want to clarify that MeToo has been around a lot longer than that. So the hashtag didn't go viral until then, but the original creator of MeToo is Tarana Burke, and she started it back in 2007, and I've got her picture up on this slide. And Alyssa Milano is often credited for starting MeToo, but she was unaware of Tarana Burke's work when she tweeted it in her accusations against Harvey Weinstein. But she did credit Burke when she realized, and I just want to honor Tarana and her work for girls and women and give her credit where it's due. So we've had about 10 years with MeToo, with Tarana's work, and 1.5, 2 years with it as a movement. And there's been lots of outrage, which is great. There's been a lot of people really feeling more apt to share their stories. And I think we can all observe sort of how that's changing us culturally. I'm feeling really positive about that. But all this outrage and story sharing still hasn't coalesced really into a defined action for things like pay equity, improved working conditions, access to childcare, reproductive freedom, and the host of other issues that go along with all those. And what we do have, though, is this opportunity of awareness. And I think it's time to ask ourselves how some of our expectations of professionalism, again, that sort of submissive nature, are rooted in patriarchal values. And another part, when we don't expect men or women to sacrifice their home lives for their work lives, things are going to get a lot better for everybody. And I hope, my hope is that the Me Too movement is drawing attention to these systemic issues that we have as a society in a really tangible way that's going to result in those things. And I think in some ways it is. When you look at just the kind of people who are getting elected to office right now, that makes me really hopeful. Okay, so we are going to move on now to some of the things that that you can do and some ways to look at this in a different way. I'm going to take another sip of tea. Thank you for being patient with me. All right, so at the beginning of this presentation, we talked about that typical advice to get ahead in the workplace, and I want to loop back to that. And we're going to talk about why some of those things don't necessarily work for women. So I'm going to give us a couple of examples here, and I took these straight from a book called What Works for Women at Work by Joan Williams and Rachel Dempsey. So that's where they came from. And again, you're going to have a whole recommended reading list. You're going to have access to that at the end of the presentation, so don't feel like you need to write any of that down. So what we know is that women are paid less than men for comparable work. We also know that women don't ask for raises as often as men or for as much when they do. So we might tell an individual woman, okay, go ask for a raise, be confident, shoot higher than you were planning to. But systemically, we know our society doesn't like women who are too assertive or who self-promote, so they can face backlash for that. So before this is always going to work for the individual, we need to address that bias. Another one, what we know, there are fewer women at the top of the corporate ladder. And to an individual, we might say, okay, well, that person isn't willing to make the same sacrifices as her male counterpart. But systemically, we know that women are still disproportionately burdened with the tasks of life at home and raising children, and that they have to work harder than their male counterparts to be recognized. And like someone called out in our chat earlier, women of color especially, there's that traditional advice that you need to work twice as hard to be recognized, and there's support for that in the research. So we need to address these imbalances, or women are going to burn out before they make it to the top, because trying to be everything is exhausting. And what we know is that we still don't associate women with jobs that require power and authority. So we might tell an individual woman, act like a man, be more assertive, embody those qualities. But systemically, we know that can backfire. So to help change the story, we need to change our perceptions of what leadership is to include the skills that are already there, that are also important, but that are more associated with women. So things like, a really great example is emotional intelligence. And we can do this by putting them in our job descriptions and discussing them at the point of interviews. So these are just a couple of examples. And again, now we're going to move further, further into what you can do to the last part of our presentation here. Okay, so what can you do? Focusing on yourself. That's the first place to start. Is working on yourself. So keep learning, because you can't change subconscious behaviors unless you recognize them for what they are. So read a book, attend webinars like this one, go to trainings, seek out activities that challenge your assumptions. And a good one that I like is, I'm going to flip over this other slide really quick. It's a Harvard implicit association testing, and I bet some of you have seen these before. There's a whole bunch of topics that you can take them about, but they're basically an online test that prompt you to make knee-jerk associations between concepts and evaluations or stereotypes. So an example would be measuring your association with fat or thin people as good or bad. And there is a test, the one that I have pictured here, that these are the results for the last, well, from between 2005 and 2015 of this test. It measures the implicit association between male and female and family and career. So I've taken this test a couple times, but the last time I took it was about 6 months ago. And I intentionally did it while I was kind of tired and busy, because I didn't want to be able to dedicate my full brain power to trying to trick the system, because I felt like that was a more accurate representation of how I go about in the world. You know, a lot of us are always multitasking. We are not always at our peak of mind. So I wanted to represent that. But so this is, again, the spread over a 10-year time period of respondents to this implicit bias test. And you can see that the vast majority of people have a strong, moderate, or slight automatic association of male with career and female with family. Not really a big surprise there. I'm happy to see that 17% had little to no automatic preference. And Harvard implicit bias test. It's just, I have a link in the, someone's asking for the name of this implicit bias test, and I have a link to that in the resources I'm going to give you guys at the end. So you'll be able to hop over to it there. And this one is, I think it's just called Male with Career and Female with Family, or male and female career and family test. But, and then there's a really small percentage down at the bottom here that associate male with family and female with career. Ideally, we're going to be here in this white. We want to move everyone to this white bar. But the last time I took it, I still had a slight automatic association with male with career and female with family. And I read about and think about these topics all the time. So it just kind of goes to show that we have these implicit biases. You can't really work on them until you know what they are. And even when you know what they are, it's hard. So it's a difficult issue, but that's where you want to start. Okay, yeah, the point is that you can't work on them unless you know what they are. So number 2, what can you do? Focusing on yourself. Remember that 60% statistic and the confidence gap, that men are happy to apply for positions when they meet 60% of the qualifications and women wait till they meet 100. So research shows that men tend to overestimate their abilities while women underestimate theirs. So the piece of advice is to be confident and go ahead and apply for those opportunities that you think are a stretch. And here I have another personal example of this. So when I got hired into the library system, I worked in youth services for a few years, and at one of the branches that I worked at, the branch manager left and that position came open. And I was really interested in the position, but I didn't want to apply because I didn't feel like I'd had enough experience. I didn't feel like I qualified or that I'd had any experience, supervisory experience. So I wasn't going to apply. And then about a week before the application deadline, I remembered reading this statistic and I made a different choice. And I went ahead and applied and I got the job. So what that's done for my life is, for one, that raised, I'm gonna be frank, and that raised my my pay by about 150%, which was huge. It allowed me to feel confident applying for graduate school, and I'm currently working on my Master's of Library and Information Science. So kind of like, like I spoke earlier about how if you delay your moving up by not going for those positions, you're setting yourself back in the long run. And so just remember that 60% statistic, go for those jobs you think are a stretch. You never know what's going to happen. And I'll say, when I've given this presentation before, some of my favorite feedback is when I've had several people come back to me and tell me that they did just that and they got the job. And I just love hearing that. So keep that in your brain, file that one away, tell your friends. So next, the third one is get comfortable talking about yourself and your own successes at work, even though it's scary because we know it can backfire socially. It's still the best way to communicate your work. So if you don't already, start tracking your accomplishments so you have them at hand. I personally keep an Excel spreadsheet, and then I have a calendar appointment each month that just pops up and reminds me to reflect on my work for the last month and add anything that I feel is appropriate. So I have that available to me when I'm doing things like job interviews or performance evaluations, or recently when I've been filling out scholarship applications for school. And it's good to use objective metrics. So if you've got like numbers to back up your accomplishments, that's excellent. But a descriptive paragraph of how you handled a tough situation is definitely appropriate too. And for me, I track things like, I track all of the educational opportunities I've taken, so all the workshops and webinars and everything I've attended. And I track, again, just all those major accomplishments at work. So it might be solving a particular issue, again, a difficult patron interaction, or that I managed to get so many people to this program with this kind of feedback. So keep that going for your career, and you'll always have it to refer back to. And then you can also keep a folder in your inbox where you store emails from colleagues that are praising your work or send positive affirmations. That's always nice. It's a confidence booster to be able to go look back at that, and that might give you some inspiration for who to ask for references. Okay, number 4, address bias when you see it. So letting it slide does not help anyone. I recently took this last year, and I think the Washington State Library actually sponsored this too, but it was a training with Dr. Caprice D. Hollins from Cultures Connecting. And she had this really great example about how she's a cigarette smoker. And she noted that when it comes to her smoking cigarettes, complete strangers will walk up to her on the street and let her know that that's going to kill her, or let her know she needs to move another 10 feet away from the building. People have no problem approaching her about her cigarette smoking. And what she said is that we need to get to the point where addressing biases like racial bias and gender bias is just as easy for us, so that we can tell somebody, hey, that's not cool. We need it to be as easy for us as approaching cigarette smokers is. I thought that was a great example. And this may or may not be easier to do with coworkers than patrons, but it's important for both. And I think this is one of those scenarios where really kind of rehearsing for yourself what you might say might really help, because it's such a fine line. It's so hard to decide what you address and what you don't. Number 5, this one I think is one of the most important ones. So resist the urge to group people into oppositional categories of us versus them, right? We're all humans are incredibly complex beings, and automatically making somebody the enemy does not give any of us the opportunity to connect with them and address the problematic behavior. But if we can build a relationship with them, on the basis of that relationship, we might be able to bring them to a different thought process. So again, resist this us versus them. It's really more nuanced than that, and we don't need to polarize ourselves anymore. And then the last one I've got for working on ourselves is organize to advance racial equality and social justice, because impacts for one group are often felt among the many. So really the point is keep learning about yourself, and that's all going to contribute to the better. Okay, so next, what can you do in regards to leading others? So what works to engage more women as leaders and reduce bias? So 1, if you're a leader in your organization, find ways to encourage self-promotion for everybody. So we know this is hard for women. This could be something as benign as getting your staff in the habit of sending you a short email a month describing a situation they might believe they handled well. What this does is it invites women to participate, and it gets rid of some of that stigma around self-promotion. It builds self-confidence, and you might learn something about your employees. But again, just to repeat, it invites women to participate. That's going to be key here, and lessens the stigma for them to celebrate their own accomplishments. So number 2. And again, you're going to have access to all of this. You're going to have all of these, so don't feel like you have to take notes. As leaders in your organization, be the one to reach out to women and again, invite them to apply for opportunities. And if they seem hesitant, explore what the root cause of that might be. Because sometimes that can just be resolved in a short conversation. And I've got another personal example here. When I was first hired into the library system, I was working in youth services part-time, and it was about 6 months into my job. I was still feeling pretty new. There's a lot to learn, and a full-time position doing the same thing came up. And again, I wasn't going to apply for it because I thought, I've only been here 6 months. There's no way they're gonna give me that position. But my boss at the time, my supervisor, she forwarded me the opportunity and encouraged me to apply. And I said, well, gee, I haven't really been here that long. Do you really think they'd hire me? And she said, oh yeah, that's not a problem. Please do apply. And I did. I got the position, which eventually led into a management position. So if she hadn't approached me, I likely would have just let that slide. I would not have applied to that. And it was such a quick, 2-minute conversation that really changed my perspective on that and got me to apply. So sometimes you never know what it is. It could be something that to you seems silly, but to them is a real barrier. So be willing to have that conversation, approach them, reach out to them. Number 3, we talked about this a little bit earlier, but using inclusive language in job descriptions, and also stop asking for previous salary on job applications. I think a lot of us already do this. I'm seeing it disappear more and more. But asking for previous salary just perpetuates the wage gap, because if they're already suffering from a wage gap, negotiating based on that number is going to result in a lower number. So just get rid of that. We don't need to know that. And as far as inclusive language and job descriptions, that's where you put things like emotional intelligence, honesty in the job description. And all those things, those qualities are absolutely a part of it, of any management job, as we all identified earlier. But we don't codify them in these job descriptions. So it can impact whether or not women see themselves in these positions. And I think making them a part of that and making them part of the interview process can help that. So number 4, offer training to those in your organization, but know that not all training is equal. And research shows that training on bias awareness specifically is the most effective kind of diversity training. So one thing that you can do is think about the end result you want. Like, what do you want people to say about your program when it's done? And design your program based around that, or hire somebody to do it based around that. Yeah, what do you want participants to say they got out of the training? All right, number 5, put in place clear policies against sexual misconduct and discrimination, as well as strong whistleblower policies. So reinforcing protections for front of the line for everyone, but front of the line library workers with a clear, explicit, and highly visible behavior policy is really important. And then once you have that, and a lot of us do, I'm sure, support staff who enforce it. So as a manager, if a patron is acting inappropriately, trust your staff members' feelings and judgment. And then give them the tools to help them respond to microaggressions. Like one thing that I think is really helpful is like a list of canned phrases that you can say. So when a patron says something inappropriate, here is a leadership sanctioned list of ways you can respond. And I think people can often be really welcome to that, because it's so hard when you're put on the spot to respond in that moment. And this can really give you something to work with, something you've practiced ahead of time, and makes it far more likely that you're going to address that situation. It helps us all feel empowered to use them, and like we're not going to get in trouble for standing up for ourselves. And again, it reduces that kind of like deer in the headlights feeling, because you've already got this practiced response. And all of this contributes to creating a service culture based on mutual respect. That's all we want. We just want mutual respect. And then 6, as an organization, work to address racial bias in all of these areas as well, because life isn't a zero-sum game, and when we support each other, we all do better. And when everyone's at the table, we all do better. All right, we're getting to the end here. So reasons for hope. Again, I just want to emphasize that it's not about replacing men. It's about working in balance together with people of all different cultural and racial backgrounds and all different genders. And some pieces that give me hope are that 1, companies with at least 1 woman on their board are shown to have a higher return on investment than companies with no women on their board. Board gender diversity significantly correlates with improved corporate social responsibility. And then gender balanced leadership teams are less susceptible to groupthink, which is that tendency of groups to conform to one opinion. So we really, when we all work together, we reach a better outcome. And then another piece that I think is just so important is that research is showing that exposure to counter stereotypical role models, so things like a female plumber, can reduce stereotyping in a completely different setting. So having frequent and high quality interactions with successful leaders of all types from a young age, or in our world, reading those books about, I wish I'd brought it with me and looked up the title before this, but there's a really excellent children's book about, it's like a Cinderella story, but Cinderella, instead of ending up being a princess, she ends up being the royal mechanic. And I just love that. So things like that, exposure to things like that, can reduce, again, stereotyping in a completely different setting for boys and girls. So my last piece of hope is just that knowing that we have so many strong women leading the way, and all of our children are watching and they're absorbing that. So the future is really is looking really bright to me, and that's what I hope that most of you take from this. All right, and that brings me to my last slide here. So this is a bit.ly link to get to this presentation with, again, all of my notes and everything I've said today. It says WLA on it because I couldn't add a second bit.ly link to the same place, and I didn't want to remove access from everybody who had come to that presentation at WLA last year, so I left it. So that's the link. You'll get book list, sources, and this is my contact information if you want to reach out to me. And that second bit.ly link down there is to access my LinkedIn, and I would be so happy to connect with any of you who would like to connect with me. Oops, back. All right, so questions. I'm trying to, hold on, my menu's not coming up here. There it is, so I can get to the chat.
Okay, so thank you, Alexa. That was really interesting. And this is actually, I have to confess, the second time I've seen this, and each time I take away something more.
Yay, I'm glad to hear that.
Thank you. And do we have any questions? If you have questions, please type them in the chat.
And if something occurs to you, later this week, again, you've got my contact information here. I love to talk about this, so feel free to just reach out to me, and I'm happy to chat.
Okay, so I don't see any questions coming in, and we're getting close to 10 o'clock, so I know sometimes people have to leave to go open their buildings, which is pretty important. So again, thank you so much, Alexa, and thank you also to everyone who attended today. And if you have any questions, Alexa's got her information up here. You can also contact us here at the Washington State Library. And we did record this today, and it will be posted on the Washington State Library training page sometime later this afternoon or tomorrow. So you can always come back and review it again. Next month, our first Tuesday's webinar will be on April 2nd, again at 9 o'clock. It will be Gavin Wolcher, who is actually the director of the Billings, Montana Public Library, will be discussing creating civil engagement and conversations within your community, and how libraries can play an important role in creating and sustaining platforms for civil engagement and community conversations. So I don't see any questions coming in, and since it's after 10, on behalf of us all here at the Washington State Library and our presenter Alexa, thank you and have a great rest of your day.